So yeah, we'll let's keep going. So Yousef, we should sort of get to your story and all this, your own personal perspective, because I mean we talked a little bit about this, and you had kind of alluded to it in previous episodes that you had done with me, and I had realized this time around when I had reached out and I said, I never actually talked to him about this. Like that must have been the craziest fucking thing in the world. The things that he must have seen, just like what was it even like to fly in? And then there's all the existential questions of like, returning to the country of my birth. Well, you were born in the US actually.
I was born in Kuwait, and then I lived my childhood in Iran, and then I came
Oh,
to
right, right, right. Okay, okay.
yeah.
But like in the sense of like the birth of your parents, return your
Yes,
parents'
absolutely.
homeland, but yours. Yeah, and so like this is this is also something that I share with you, is that like I was, my conscious memory is of like this world, but there was like a war going on when I was born. So like it's interesting to think that you went back in the midst of this war, and also like in that way, in the kind of demographic that you represented, people like you were one of the main characters in the portrayal of the necessity of the war, right? Like all these Iraqis in the diaspora, they actually speak for and represent them. Back then. It was a pretty crude machine. They had Ahmed Chalabi and a few others, but today it's like there's thousands of them, and they're all diverse stripes, and they all have different constituencies. And like the Comprador machine was very in its infancy, relatively speaking, back in the sort of 2003 days. But like in a way, people coming from the US, Iraqis like you, were kind of this class of people who were represented as like one of the targets of this war, one of the people who will, same thing with, freaking Karzai. Karzai was a restaurateur living in Boston, and then they made him the president of Afghanistan. they
Yeah,
just
and now they're trying to undermine his any kind of credibility he has, because
yeah,
now he's talking against them. So
it's true. Yeah,
it's
he
this
soured
back
on
and
them.
forth that you
Yeah,
talked about.
they can just do that. They could just like plop. There you go. Here's a country of tens of millions.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I I went to Iraq for the first time in 2005. I was in the U.S. I was just graduating from undergrad, and to be quite honest with you, I didn't know what I was going to do. I had no plans. I was thinking about grad school. I was thinking broadly, just like figure out like community organizations to apply to for jobs for, doing different things. And I got a call from a mentor of mine, who Dr. Talib Aziz, who actually I consider to be one of the great historians of the Islamists in Iraq, of the Shia Islamists, and great political thinker of Iraq. I mean, he writes in Arabic, but he used to live in Los Angeles. He had happened to go to Iraq right after the invasion in 2003, and so he randomly calls me. I was at a labor rally at UCLA, and he said that, hey, I need someone to would you be willing to come to Iraq to work for me? I need basically a researcher, someone who speaks English and could deal with Americans, and who could do research for me in English. And he told me, look, I can't pay you anything, but I could find a place for you to live in the green zone. And the green zone was this place that was about, geographically speaking, like 15% of Baghdad, very centrally located. And it was a neighborhood where people lived, but also a place where a lot of the ministries used to be, including the Republican Palace. So the Americans had created this green zone, and they had created it by putting these big T-walls, these cinder block concrete walls that now have become like I feel like a symbol of the 21st century, but they started off in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you see them now everywhere, and including the borders and what have you. So he's like, I could that green zone. He's like, I could get you into there, and you could. And I could provide you with food and housing, but you kind of have to pay your own way to get here. And so for me, I was like, yes, absolutely, I'll go. And in some way, and he was working at the time as an advisor to the Iraqi Prime Minister Ibrahim al-Jafari, who was part of the Hizb al-Dawa, or the Dawa party. And he was the first prime minister that was elected supposedly democratically, and he was supposed to kind of overlook or oversee the Iraqi government while the permanent constitution was being written. And so then his term was supposed to end when the constitution gets voted on, and once the constitution got voted on, then you will go to the processes to elect the government based on what the constitution kind of lays out. And so I accepted, and I went to Iraq for the first time. I had never been there. I landed in Baghdad. This was, right during the insurgency. So this is when like airplanes would circle on top of Baghdad for a little bit and then do this nosedive in, because they had to limit the time in which they're using to land because they could get shot down. And so it was like, you land really quickly and you're in this airport that is beautiful, but yet it's empty. It's kind of eerie. And I had three gentlemen pick me up, and I went to this car, and they opened up the trunk, and each one pulled out their AK-47 and their handguns, and then they pulled those out and they put my bags in there. And at that time I was like, wait, what did I just do? Where am I? I had friends who were going to law school and grad school. Yeah. And I'm in this car that flies down and goes all the way to the green zone. And then they had some kind of a note that got me in. And so part of the problem that I later on realized was that in order to get in and out of the green zone it's very hard to get in. It's easy to get out, but it's very hard to get in. And so one of the ways you could get into the green zone and move about within the green zone is have a DOD ID, a Department of Defense ID. That was a green card. And I never was able to get one of those cards because I didn't work for the Americans. I worked for the office of the Iraqi Prime Minister. And so I had a card that said at the end, I got a card that said employee of the office of the Iraqi Prime Minister, which I thought in my head, I was like, well, this is a big deal. I should be able to go wherever I want. And in reality, that was one of the least useful cards you could have. You couldn't get in anywhere except for the office of the Prime Minister and that's it. Whereas if you had the DOD badge, the Department of Defense badge, not only could you get into the office of the Prime Minister, you could get into where he actually lived. You could get into his bedroom and sleep in his bed. But you couldn't do it the other way around. And that was like this kind of very symbolic way of like, okay, this is how power operates here. And so once I was able to get in, I could never get a Department of Defense badge or any other badge. And so I was stuck for 6 months between three buildings. The building I lived in was the Rashid Hotel, which used to be this very important hotel where the guests of honor and whatever or really rich people used to be in. It was at that time, it was where a lot of the kind of NGOs would be at, Iraqis, but even that was done hierarchically. So if you were if you were important, you were within the first 4 floors. If you were a little bit less important, you were between floors 4 to 6. Floor 7 was bombed out, and then I was put into floor 8. So I was on top of the floor that was completely bombed out. And the higher you went, the less important you were, because those were the places that were easy to shoot at, because this is a big building. So I was in that hotel, and I realized there was a couple of weeks into my stay that there's all these like bullet holes in the windows from like previous iteration of the insurgency. And the building right next to me was the convention center that had been turned into the parliament. And that was overseen by the 3rd Infantry Division that controlled all of Baghdad. And then right next to it was the office of the General Secretariat. So this is where, most of Iraq's business was happening in that building. And next to that was the office of the Prime Minister. So these are 4 buildings on what you could imagine to be as big as maybe 3 or 4 soccer fields or football fields lengthwise. And so every day I would go, and I couldn't get into the convention center. I could only get into the office of the Prime Minister and my hotel. And between my hotel and the office of the Prime Minister, so these are 4 soccer field lengths, there were 7 different checkpoints. And these 7 different checkpoints were manned by Georgian soldiers, Salvadorian soldiers, and Nepalese soldiers, who changed depending on the different mercenary contractor company that their contract would stop, and then the new group would come in. And so the Georgians, the Nepalese, the Salvadorians were there, and behind them were the Americans, who were kind of overlooking this whole operation. And so every day you had to get out and move through these 7 different checkpoints by the time you got to the office of the Prime Minister. Now, if I had the DoD badge, I would, you could just go. There's nobody stopping you. But for me, I had to talk and answer to each one of them. At some point, they all got to know me. Until then, they would switch over and a new set of crew would come in. So I never consider myself having gone to Iraq or live in Iraq for 6 months. I went to the Green Zone. And I really didn't. I saw the ramifications. I saw the consequences of the occupation, but I never had to necessarily. I left the Green Zone 2 times within my 6 months. Otherwise, I was just in those 2 buildings, going back and forth, back and forth.
You couldn't walk around the Green Zone, other parts of the Green Zone?
No, because if I had another checkpoint, then I wouldn't have the badge to get me in there. Because I had a badge to get into the hotel, and I had a badge to get into the Prime Minister's office. So in order for me to move, there were other parts of the Green Zone that were, there were restaurants that popped up that serving kind of all of this hodgepodge of foreigners and Iraqi expats who now had come back. There were restaurants, hookah spots that I wanted to go to, and I could never go to unless I was with someone who had a DoD badge, who could be kind of the one who's yeah, he's with me. And as long as that he said I'm with them, then they had the authority to take people. So I always had to be the guest of somebody to leave that area. The one time that I left the area without that person, and I tried to come back in the Green Zone, and I went to the Kadhimiya Mosque. I went to get a haircut and just to check out the Kadhimiya Mosque, which in Baghdad. When I came back, the Americans who were manning those checkpoints, they wouldn't let me in, and so it happened to be the soldier was from California, and that looked at my ID, and I was like, "Yo, I'm from California. This is my story. Here's my California ID," and then we kind of struck up a conversation, and he just kind of let me in. But otherwise, I would have kind of been stuck there, and that person who took me out got a talking to from my boss about yo, you can't take this dude out, what the consequences are and all that.
It's crazy to think that I still can't believe you were in the Green Zone. I can't even that's you saw this is the technocratic administrative center of the U.S. empire's occupation, colonial occupation of Iraq. Yeah, the contour of the colonialism. Okay, we can talk about it. I guess part of this conversation, of the first half of that conversation when Nick was here, is that how does American empire function in different case studies, right? That in a place that in modern, what's called Iowa today, it unfolded in a certain way, but in a place called Iraq, it unfolds in this way, and it has that kind of relation, and depends on the time and whatever and the context. But ultimately, that's one empire, 2 different sort of projects of conquest. That seems to be a kind of that was one of the through lines of that first half of the conversation, man. I guess through the memoir side of things, the things you must have seen in that prime minister's office, because the country was being resequenced. Its genome, it's the state. They smashed it they smashed this like 50-year-old Ba'athist state, not 50-year-olds, what, 60 something custom they overthrew in 60 something. So let's say
63, they came into power, they lost power, and then they came back into power.
right.
So
Right. So let's say 40 years.
Yeah.
40 years of the Ba'athist state.
70s to yeah.
Yeah, like overall, right? Like, and much of it under this one guy who's disappeared somewhere. And the military that had, that was so like, revered and stuff that was so big, supposedly, was defeated in a few weeks, right? Like, of course, there was still an insurgency, and that defeat was not completely, like, the U.S. actually did suffer quite some losses in those early things that were, of course, covered up by our loyal media. And like the embeddedness, that was a whole moment. But like, it's also, it's crazy to think though that like the technocratic side you like saw and were like a participant of, but like in the way that people, the resequencing act is like this, it's like this global task, right? That it like brings in a whole global cast of characters through different ways. And like, yeah, diaspora is part of it, but as you made clear, it's not just, this is not, the conquest of Iraq was not an American story, right? It was like a whole global endeavor. It really was the coalition of the willing. I mean, they weren't joking when they named it that, because it was a coalition. Like, what was the third biggest country there was Ukraine. I mean, yeah, in terms of numbers, it was two large powers, right? The US and the UK, who gave the majority of things, and then a bunch of other countries who were vassals of the US or allies of the US, giving these symbolic, or not so symbolic, I guess in the case of Ukraine, because it was like 5K or something, but like ultimately like fairly like nominal contributions. And to say that like as a kind of tribute, because it was such like a foreign policy like target of like the Bush administration of like those first years, that it was like one of their main goals, so that like people who were their allies in different countries decide, okay, we're gonna do it too. Like, we're like, put our sticker on that UV van, like we're here for you. That kind of thing. And to think that like you saw this up close. I mean, I can't even, what do I even ask you? Like, what's the crazy shit you saw? Like, what do I even say? Like, how many, I guess like the 7 checkpoints, each of those encounters, how tense were they? I imagine they like, because like, the green zone was fairly safe, right? The green zone didn't get hit that much.
Yeah, I mean, it got hit a little bit more the later I stayed. Because in 2000 it starts getting worse and worse in 2005. But no, initially, I mean, yeah, compared to everywhere else in Iraq, I mean, this is also the time of like people getting kidnapped, people getting murdered. There's a lot of, the Americans don't really have control over Baghdad. They have control. I mean, there's all this of like, oh yeah, they took over within 12 days. But in some ways they didn't. I mean, yet they toppled. Saddam's government was, if you think about in Gramscian terms, it's like a war of maneuver. You take out the central castle, right, where Saddam collapses, but now you have all of these disparate forces everywhere else. So the Americans don't really have control over Baghdad. They have control over the green zone. So there was like, you would get some lobbed missiles or whatever into the green zone, but it wasn't, by the time I was there, it wasn't that much. The Americans had made sure that they kind of controlled those areas. But there was a couple of times that the Republican Palace, which became the U.S. Embassy, got hit when I was there, and things like that. So it was ongoing.
Did the people you must have like encountered there must have been such a strange assortment of people? Man. Because there's the military, but then there's the civic administrative, right? And that overlap is also called intelligence.
Let me make, so I want to tell you some of the people that I met, but I want to say 2 things in response to what you were saying. First, in terms of like, again, this like winning and losing, and you had mentioned in the part where we talked when Nick was here about how some people at some point are your friends and all of a sudden they become your enemies. The same thing was happened in Iraq. So when the Americans go in, they disband the Iraqi military. They start the process of de-Baathification. The process of de-Baathification, which was to say that if you were involved with the Iraqi government, somehow you no longer can be part of the new society, the new economy, the new politics. For example, I mean, just because of de-Baathification, something on the magnitude of 14,000 people who worked in the Department of Education got fired.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I meant about sowing chaos. That's what they did. That was the goal of de-Baathification. I mean, even the crazy thing of the euphemism of de-Baathification obviously comes from like the Nazi thing of denazification. But it's like the Baath was the state, was the backbone of the state. Like it was the party through which you would affiliate to then become, you know, a deputy director of like the health, like public health or something like that.
But this is where for me, like to say that they wanted to do that is to give them too much credit. Is to give them the credit that they planned to do this and they planned to sow the chaos. When I think about it, I think this is part of their stupidity. It's part of their lack of planning. It's part of the fact that they actually don't know any better. That there is actual material consequences to creating a policy based on fantasy. When you create a policy around a fantasy, you're creating a policy based on something that doesn't exist. So your policy is going to go wrong. They were stupid. I mean, you know, racism is both complex because it has to sow a good story and sell you on it. And it's stupid because the idea of it is plainly wrong if you deal with the real world around us. And so this is them too. That I don't want to take away the fact that they were bad at what they did. They weren't good at it. They didn't control everything. They didn't, their plans didn't go based off of what they wanted. And so they destroyed because they were bad at what they did. So de-Baathification had the opposite, like they had all kinds of unintended consequences that undermined their own plan. They thought that they could just get rid of the Iraqi army for no reason. And nothing was going to happen. And so what ends up happening was that the Iraqi army, random people within the army, this is how they made their living. Like, I mean, they're getting paid by the Iraqi government to be in the army. Now you don't want to give them money. How are they supposed to survive? So what do? They join the insurgency. And they're a part of the insurgency, not the total part, but an important part of it. And for the Americans, they're like, yeah, we're not going to negotiate with them. Oh, we're not going to negotiate with Ba'athist. Oh, we're not going to negotiate with this, because they just believe that they're going to win the war so easily. Just like they said, oh, we're not going to negotiate with the Taliban before invading Afghanistan. As if like, oh yeah, who are these people? We're not going to negotiate with them. And then what ends up happening in Iraq is that they can't quell the insurgency. They just can't. They're not good at it. Again, they go into Fallujah. They level the entire city. You know, people like to. I always want to talk about this case.
They did it twice,
and in both cases, they do the very same thing that then they say the Assad regime does in Syria. What does the Assad regime do? You get rid of the people, and then you bombard the city from the top down. You raise it, and then you move in. What do the Americans do in Fallujah? The same thing. There's
with depleted uranium too.
Yeah, I mean, there's the depleted uranium, but there's one place they tell civilians you get out, and then they just bomb it to smithereens, and then they move in their Marines. So that's part. So there's this insurgency that happens in 2007. The American narrative of itself says, oh, they got this amazing General Petraeus, who then the Bush administration gave them the policy of the surge. And because of the surge, you had this great awakening amongst the Sunni tribes. And thus, you know, they were able to quell the insurgency. Well, what actually happened is that the Americans turned against their previous policy. And they said, oh, we need to deal with the ex-Ba'athist. We need to deal with the ex-military people. And they put them on their payroll, and they started giving them money. And then all of a sudden, oh, you didn't have this problem. So between 2003 and 2007, you experimented with a failed policy because of which people died, and because of which you yourself couldn't rule as the Americans. and then you just turn around and you say, and you do the exact opposite, but you sell it as you did something else. You give it this term, the surge and the awakening, as if people like somehow had an epiphany. It wasn't an epiphany. They started getting paychecks.
Yeah.
And then paychecks that stopped when Maliki came in, and then he had another problem because you hadn't structurally integrated or socially integrated people, because the Constitution was a sham. The process of writing the Constitution didn't resolve any kind of Iraqi problems because the Americans forced the Iraqis into the draft Constitution based on the deadlines that were important to the Bush administration because of the electoral campaigns that were being had in the United States. So, you know, again, this for me, this is an example of what you're talking about. A random person, like the same group of people, at some point are your friends, then they become your enemies, then they become your friends again. So that's one. The second thing I wanted to say, because you were talking about Ukraine or the coalition of the willing, this is just a random thing, but I think it's important. You know, out of all of the post-Soviet republics that became part of NATO, only 3 of them fought. So all of the Soviet republics that became now part of NATO, all of them were part of the coalition of the willing. So I'm talking about here Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, all joined NATO in 2004 after they were part of the coalition of the willing. There were 3 countries.
That was their reward.
That was their reward 1 year after. There were 3 countries that didn't, and that was Ukraine, Georgia, and Uzbekistan. Georgia and Ukraine were both invaded by Russia, both of which were part of the coalition of willing that didn't become part of NATO. So there's a larger story that could be had about that, but I think it's important to kind of see the Iraq war as part of the larger machinations of the United States, NATO, what it was going to do in the post-Soviet world. And then the third thing you said was like my kind of like meeting with people. I think it was really difficult being there. I was really, what was really palpable to me was I wasn't the same as people. I wasn't Iraqi in the same way as other people were. I was an Iraqi who had never lived in Iraq, whose first interaction in Iraq was through the Green Zone. And then there were all these Iraqis who had lived there, who had gone through 91, the siege for 13 years, 2003, the shock and awe, and still living. And I was, honestly, I was embarrassed all the time. Yeah, because people had stories, and you're like, and they would come to me telling me this, especially in the hotel, the workers in the hotel. I remember going to, I was buying DVDs from the store in the hotel because I got to do something with my time. I'm stuck. I
did that in Syria too. I bought so many DVDs.
I had so many DVDs of everything that was in the U.S. I was like, I had all of the Simpsons episodes from the first season to the last. Seinfeld, I don't know what. These were the West Wing. I don't know why I was a fan of the West Wing at that time.
Watching the West Wing in the Green Zone. Oh my God.
So the guy,
that's gonna be the name of your memoir, The West Wing in the Green Zone.
Yeah, I was young and I didn't know any better because I watched it now and I'm like, what is this trash? And I was watching, you know, I was into random soliloquies for no reason about the greatness of American democracy. But the guy who sold me those DVDs, like the first time I met him, he was like he was I think he had lost an arm. There was something wrong with his eyes. I couldn't, like, he wasn't, like, it was obvious that something had happened to him. And so he showed me all these pictures of his car being completely demolished. And he told me the story of, like, he got hit by a tank and the tank went over his car. And part of it was at some point at the beginning of the occupation, the tanks and the American personnel and the mercenaries, when they would drive around, you could drive next to them. So, you know, they would be in a traffic jam with the rest of the cars. At some point, they started getting hit up by the insurgents. So then they institute a policy that you have to be within, I forget, like 100 meters or some distance of front, back, left to right of these cars. So when a tank comes by or an American like GMC or Chevy is driving, it has a sign that says you have to be 100 meters away from this vehicle or else you will be shot. Now, the problem is you can't really read that sign unless you're really close to the car. And no memo goes out to people. So a lot of people get shot and killed or maimed because of the fact that the Americans all of a sudden decide like, oh, it's not safe for us, so we're instituting this new policy. So this man he got caught up in that. I have a cousin who got shot and killed with her daughter at a checkpoint because something happened and the Americans thought she was coming and she told her to stop and she didn't stop or something, and she got murdered. There was every single person there had a story, and what are you supposed to do? And you're like a kid who's there like, why am I here? And they're telling me this because they think because I'm in that hotel that I have some pull with someone. They don't necessarily know who. And then all of my colleagues were like, don't tell anybody where you work. But of course I was like, nah, whatever. I told everybody where I worked. Because at some point after a couple of months, I was just like honest with everyone. I was like, this is who I am. I'm sorry. This place sucks. Your government sucks. The people I work with suck. Nobody's thinking about you. Because it was like, what's the point?
I mean, all they wanted was the oil, Yousef. They got the oil. So of course they didn't give a shit about what's left over. I mean, this is the American way, bro.
I mean, they didn't even get the oil. The oil contracts were first signed by Total, the French company, the Chinese later on, the Turks were in there. Again, I really don't think the Americans were fighting in the same way that the British used to fight previously in Iraq. They really opened up Iraq for the global economy. And in that sense, the American state fought on behalf of global capital.
I mean, that's the shape of neoliberal empire today. Like that's the goal. It's to crack open and to do shock therapy. I mean, talk about Ukraine and Russia. This was the goal of 90s Russia. They tried to do it through NGOs, right? So it's the opposite of the Iraq story where they couldn't do it through NGOs. So they do it through war and then bring in the NGOs later. Whereas with Russia, it was the internal collapse of the USSR. And then they helped regime change. They helped regime change that Boris Yeltsin came in power, who was their ally, who was their useful friend. And boom, right, open it all up to. I mean, there's a great article called "How Harvard Lost Russia," and it sort of outlines all this. So yeah, like it's like the U.S. I mean, I guess the question we keep going, the sort of argument we're having throughout all of this is the intentionality. This is the comp-lit guy in me talking, the literary critic, the intentional fallacy. That like, what are the intentions of the author? Like when we're talking about a text, it's like, oh, what did the author try to do in this? It's like, it doesn't matter. That our task as readers is to kind of like come up with an analysis. And so like, it seems to me like when I keep saying like, oh, they sow chaos, you're saying is that's an effect and not the goal. That's a consequence of, that's a sort of, that's an inadvertent consequence of like just this like bumbling or whatever, like the policy. I would say it is like, no, the stupidity is baked in for a reason. Like it's meant to be this bumbling sideshow because ultimately like the conquest of a country it cannot be a scientific act, right? It's violent. It's boots stomping through people's doors. It's chasing them in the streets. It's hunting down little children. So you terrorize them. I mean, this is the resounding paradox for me of like the moment we're in right now, which is we have all the tools at our disposal in terms of the mimetic sort of, which is to say we have cameras and recorders and all these things. We can represent reality, right? And in fact, the representation of reality is in the hands of the people authoring that reality. So soldiers in Iraq had cameras with them. They carry tens of thousands with them, probably. There are documentaries I've come across of like homemade documentaries. And it's like, I once ran into a bunch of them at like a video store and I didn't have the courage to buy it there. I should have. just as like a record, and God knows how many there are, and then how many immature ones there are, and how many things that people have deleted, and how many crimes. And so they kept a record, an archive of their crimes, partly, and this is the crazy thing, partly to show the people they've conquered and say, look what we can do to you. Don't resist if you want. And that's why it's shock and awe, right? But on the other hand, at the same time, you're running this fantasy for your own population that, oh, we're civilizing these savage fucks. We're civilizing these barbaric Arabs. Like, what was the thing that, what's his name said? That Tucker Carlson, you know, he said something about like they're barbaric and stuff. Like, he was there. It turns out he was there. He was part of the CIA there. Like, that's how like a whole class of people got careers out of the conquest of Iraq. The violent, like, colonial conquest and occupation and pillaging of Iraq. I mean, Tom Cotton has pictures standing over Iraqi gold, and now he's like a hawk, like senator, right? Like that guy with the eye patch, fucking pirate guy, Crenshaw or something. Like, there's a whole U.S. dragoon soldier to politician, you know, pipeline, right? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know how you, as this Iraqi living in the U.S., I guess you're Iraqi American, and it's fair to say. Like, I don't know how you can even, like, what do you even say to like a soldier who, I mean, what you said earlier was so nuts. Soldiers coming to you in like a confessional mode. Like, I don't know what, I guess it's like you're in that moment, you're their professor. So I guess something else kicks in. That sort of, I don't know. Because I don't think Americans have really reckoned with it. Most of the truth of what they did in Iraq was kept from them. Like, for the first year, it was on the TVs, and they just moved on. You know, and then the worst stuff that they did all over again in 2010s when they pulled out, right? That they continue, that they, you know, the through negation, in a sense, through, like, was it, I think Maliki gave that interview where he talked about how they wouldn't give them helicopters to fight Daesh and stuff like that. Like, it's same old story of torturing this country. You know, I can't even imagine what it's like for you in that moment where someone's like, I feel really bad.
I mean, I think those things are, you know, true too, because who are these students who
they're not lying.
You know,
yeah, they do feel bad.
They feel, I mean, and they are part of kind of the internal contradictions of the United States. I mean, these are you know, I'm at a state school, so most of my students are working class students. They're poor. They were the ones that were the casualties of neoliberal restructuring. And they also signed up because, I mean,
but it's a volunteer. Like, U.S. is a volunteer military. Yeah.
What the United States invests at that time, I think, something like $11,000 per recruit in terms of advertising, in terms of having recruiters on high schools, in terms of junior ROTC programs, forcing high schools, instead of giving money for physical education, to put people either in cadet programs to enter into the police force or ROTC program to join the military. I mean, there's a concerted effort to get this group of people to fight the war. And that gives them a source of, like, okay, I'm doing something positive. I'm doing something because I can't do any of these other things. Nobody tells me how to get into a community college or go to a 4-year university. I don't even know what the purpose of that is if there's no jobs. There's all of these kind of things that they're dealing with, and that they go into this war. And then I saw them when I was in Iraq. Like, here you are in it's very hot. You're wearing vest on vest on vest. You don't speak Arabic. People around you hate you. You can't communicate with them. There's no translators. You don't know why you're there at some point. You've been told all these things, but in that moment of heat and exhaustion and nobody understands, you're like, you know, there is a limit by which the discourse starts to, like, fizzle. And then they see trauma, whether that is, you know, women who are being assaulted within the ranks of the U.S. military, or what you do to other people, and then you come back and you sit with that. And so, you know, I empathized with that. I mean, and so I saw my role as a teacher, like, let's take the disavowal away. If you take that away, if you take away the ability
which was
to
their
deflect.
act in coming to confess to you. They
Yes.
were refusing that disavowal, so to speak.
Yes. And so it's like, okay, well, here's the picture. And now how do you deal with that picture? And so I mean, for me, this makes sense to with these individual students. And because, I mean, they sat there for an entire semester. So we talked about all kinds of things about colonialism, neocolonialism. Having said that, this wasn't an act of like, oh, let's raise awareness. And if we raise awareness, enough people will get to understand Iraq, and thus this won't happen again. I don't buy into that, because the dehumanization is constructed by the geopolitics. It's not the other way around. It's not because, oh, they're dehumanized that we went into Iraq. No, we go into Iraq and thus we dehumanize people in order to go into Iraq. So like, you know, if we raise awareness, it doesn't necessarily mean the policy is going to change. Sure, we should raise awareness because we should be good human beings that believe that other people are human beings like us, and we shouldn't buy into the white supremacy that is endemic as part of kind of liberal understanding of self, society, and the world. But like, I don't teach them because somehow that's going to make sure that another Iraq doesn't happen. Because if another Iraq was supposed to happen, if they will create the process of dehumanizing in order to do that. And I think that in the United States, we are primed for it, because we cannot contend with the sectarianism that is within the United States, or the legacy of death and violence that is part of the construction of the United States. And if you cannot contend with that over here, there's no way you're going to deal with that over there.
Well, it's also a nice way to resolve those contradictions, right? And so, like, as you said, like, you know, I mean, this is the classic image also of the Vietnam War. Like, you watch those movies, those famous movies, and it's a diverse crew of most, I mean, yes, it has to do with the sort of proletarianization of the American military during the Vietnam War. However, that proletarianization was, you know, was kind of classed through the conscription and whatever, and there's all that. But fast forward to 2003, where you have an all-volunteer military, U.S. military, but the same class contradictions of the U.S. still are part of the genome of that military. So you do have disproportionate sort of grunts who are from places where you teach, mostly, right? Who did volunteer. And here's my question though, like, and I guess this is always the thing, is that like the way that you're told to be a good American is that if you can't sort of, you're some kid living in this, you know, living in some backwater in the suburbs somewhere, and you don't have much of a future, right? And then there's all this race hate being stoked around Arabs and Muslims and 9/11, and they play it on loop nonstop for a year and a half, and they start sending the most like vociferous, you know, you have this president who speaks in these crusader like language about class of civilization. I mean, like, people ate this stuff up. I mean, we're children of that era. Like, we're basically the same age, you and I, and this is what we were forged on. Just this insanely violent rhetoric that like started with 9/11, and it sort of grew, and it also morphed in like the 2010s to like these violent sort of regime change wars that were masked as liberation and sold, manufactured as like, oh, liberation, right? Or civil war, right? But ultimately, like, the hands of the West and the hands of military contradictors are the same machine of regime change that directly assaulted Iraq, right, through the U.S. military, has then been sort of applied to this. I mean, I was thinking about, imagine what the Shia in Iraq could have done in 1991 if they had the support that the Sunnis and had in Syria in 2011. Imagine if they were given $2 trillion by the Gulf to support them. But no, they were in fact hampered, denied, and even though after being told to revolt. I mean, this is the legacy. Everything America has done in Iraq has been to torture and suffer, to like, or the result. I mean, whether you intend it or not, I guess is immaterial. The result is the same. And I guess, I mean, right now it's interesting now, like the Iraqi government, was it last year? They officially passed legislation that says, please leave Iraq. So the U.S. is occupying Iraq legally, according to the very democratic political system that the U.S. was there to create. So it's like, how does, like, the snake eats its own tail of political intention? It's crazy. We live in the craziest time.
Yeah, and you know, and just to add, like in terms of legality, the war in Iraq was never legal. It was always illegal because it didn't like go through the UN, because remember the UN said no, and that's why the coalition is of the willing as opposed to a coalition based on law. That was supposedly the 1991 war, and then the occupation itself, the laws that they implemented were clearly against international law, very clearly against because based on the Hague Convention, an occupying force, the responsibility of the well-being of the population, that is their number one duty, and they cannot change or alter fundamental laws to the land that they're occupying. That doesn't happen. The occupation implements all kinds of laws. They implement a constitution, all kinds of. They redo. They write 112 laws, 30% of which are about the economy. So all of this is kind of illegal. You know, I think the other story that, like, you know, you mentioned that I am no longer telling as much, but I do think is important is the struggle of Iraqis in terms of pushing back, in terms of trying to do something else. For me, I don't tell that story because I don't anymore. One, because I'm not in Iraq. I don't know. It's very hard to tell what's happening on the ground if you're not on the ground. But more fundamentally, I think it's like the people who are listening to me are here in the United States. And the people I am talking to mostly is people here in the United States. Unfortunately, I'd love to be in conversation with inside of Iraq, but I'm not. And so given that I'm here, I think there's no reason to talk about Iraq. It's more important to constantly point the gaze back at the United States, to be like, look, we are here. Look at what you're doing, and look at your own internal contradictions and anxieties, and look at what your psychosis is doing, not only to yourself, but to the entire world around you. So I find that to be the role that I play. But at the same time, I think it wouldn't be true to say that, okay, you shouldn't look at Iraq, you should look at the United States. So rather, it's to look at how the two are connected to each other. So how did Iraq then, it's not so much about how the United States constructed Iraq, but it's also how what happened in Iraq reconstructed the United States itself. And so in that sense, what the Iraqis do in Iraq is quite important. The various kinds of movements that they take up, what was happening in 2019 before the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and his Iraqi counterpart, that is very important. And I think there is where you start to see the fact that that power isn't all powerful, that there's these big cracks in it as well. And I think for me, who is prone to having despair, it's it's understanding and paying more closer attention to what's happening in that sense that gives me a feeling of what John Berger talks about as undefeated despair when he talked about the Palestinians. So I think that's important analytically to be part of the conversation that we're having.
Yousef, it's been over 2 hours. I've kept you. Thank you so much. That's a good way to end things. This will be on my feed, one way or another, and the other episode will be on Red Nation feed. Thank you so much for your time, Yousef. Thank you for sharing these reflections. It's been really great. We should keep the conversation going. You're always welcome back on my show, and you're also always welcome to talk to guest host and interview Iraqis. Like if you have people who just want to talk about the Iraq that they knew, you should do an episode. I mean, I completely mean that. I'm not totally.
No,
so you should totally do that, and that'd be good. I mean, I personally am like, I said this in one of the episodes I've done, is that like I haven't talked about Iraq enough on this show, that it's like just something that pops up every now and then, and now I'm part of this kind of like mourning, like marker memory moment of that, like, oh, it's 20 years. Like, okay, we'll talk about it in 5 years again. Like, we'll let the same weirdos write these.
It's hard, man. It's hard, like like trying to prepare for like what am I gonna say in this conversation with you all was just overwhelming because where do you start, where do you end, how do you even enter into the conversation? It's like 50 years of intervention, of death, of deceit, of lies, all of which is said to be not that. It's like, oh yeah, that wasn't lies, and so you're sitting there like,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, it's
And it was
just
done for their own
insane.
benefit. It was
Yeah.
done for their own liberation. I mean, I'll never forget the New York Times after the Jaffrey election. They did the blue dye on people's fingers. So
Yeah.
everyone, like, they have all these pictures of like women in hijab, like holding their fingers up, and it was like, oh yeah, they got their democracy sandwich delivered. Oh my god, and it was just like this smug, just liberal spiking of the football. Like,
Yeah,
even though with
as
all
if-
their, like, it's just the stupidest fucking thing. It's just like a juvenile idea, but one fucking election and there we go. We've arrived at the land of democracy. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, oh, let the people who vote back and forth between two ideas that they believe everything in the world could be separated into two different parties and they go back and forth oscillating every 4 years. These people are going to teach the rest of the world about democracy. I mean, in that sense, what's so difficult about the notion of going in a booth and voting for two different things? Because that's literally all they think democracy is. Democracy is just a means of deciding between two competing elites. This is the most derivative, reductionist understanding of democracy that could ever be. So I mean, you could do an entire conversation about just democracy and what that means and the United States, and so somehow they're there trying to teach Iraqis this thing. So it's infuriating.
Boggles the mind, my friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've exhausted you. Look at the look of defeat on your face.
Undefeated despair, my friend. Undefeated despair.